She gave him a key to her home on a Tuesday evening in December, and she was smiling when she did it. She did not know his real name. She did not know about the woman 3 miles away whose bank accounts he was slowly, methodically draining. She did not know about the wife who had filed a restraining order. She only knew the warmth of his voice at 8:15 every morning, and the way he had looked at her, that first evening, like she was exactly what he had been searching for. What happens when the love of your life turns out to be someone who was never real at all? Thematic angle: emotional manipulation plus romance scam plus secret double life plus redemption and reconstruction. Location: Naples, Florida, United States. Synopsis: after years alone, Margaret trusts a charming stranger, only to discover manipulation, stolen money, and a secret family hiding behind his lies. The Gulf of Mexico had a way of lying to you. Margaret Elaine Calloway had lived in Naples long enough to know that 63 years of life, 22 of them in this sun-soaked corner of southwest Florida, had taught her that the water could look impossibly blue and perfectly still, even when the currents beneath it were treacherous. She had learned to appreciate that particular kind of beauty, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return, the kind that simply existed and let you breathe. She was breathing now, sitting on the wooden bench at Laudermilk Park with her shoes off and her feet tucked beneath her, a paperback novel resting open on her lap. She wasn't reading it. She hadn't been reading it for the past 20 minutes. Instead, she was watching a brown pelican glide low over the water, its prehistoric shadows skimming the surface, and thinking, not for the first time that week, about how quiet her house had become since Carol moved to Denver. Carol was her youngest. 34, fiercely independent, working as a physical therapist in a city that apparently needed her more than Naples did. Margaret understood. She had raised her daughter to be exactly the kind of woman who would leave when something better called. She was proud of Carol. She was also, in the particular way that only mothers of grown children understand, achingly lonely. Her older son, Patrick, called every Sunday from Tampa. They talked about football, about his kids, about Margaret's herb garden, and whether she was eating enough protein. Patrick was steady and reliable in the way that second children often are, present but at a comfortable distance, close enough to care, far enough to avoid complication. She loved him dearly and knew he would be at her door within the hour if she needed him. She just never wanted to need him. Her husband Donald had passed 6 years ago. A stroke, quick and clean, the way he would have wanted it if he'd had any say. They had been married for 31 years, and while it had not always been a perfect marriage, whose was, it had been a real one, built on shared breakfasts and disagreements about the thermostat and the specific comfort of knowing someone else's breathing patterns in the dark. When he died, Margaret had spent the first year simply learning how to exist in a house built for two. She had managed. She had more than managed. She had rebuilt. She kept her garden, maintained her friendships, volunteered at the Naples Humane Society on Tuesday mornings, took a watercolor class at the community center that she was comically bad at but genuinely enjoyed. She had constructed a life that was full and meaningful and genuinely good. It was only on evenings like this one, watching the light turn the gulf into hammered gold, that she allowed herself to feel the particular texture of the empty space beside her. She was not looking for anyone. She wanted to be very clear about that, at least to herself. She was not one of those women who defined herself by the presence or absence of a man. She had watched too many of her friends make desperate, painful choices from that place of need, and she had sworn to herself, firmly and repeatedly, that she would never become that woman. She was thinking this thought with some satisfaction when the man sat down at the other end of her bench. She didn't look up immediately. People sat on benches at Laudermilk all the time. It was a public park, a popular one, full of retirees and young families and tourists with expensive sandals and sunburned shoulders. She continued watching the pelican. Magnificent bird, the man said. His voice was warm, slightly graveled, the kind of voice that suggested years of easy laughter. She glanced over. He was perhaps 65, perhaps a little older, with silver hair kept neat at the temples, and the kind of tan that came from actually living in Florida rather than visiting it. He was dressed simply, khaki shorts, a pale blue linen shirt, white boat shoes, and he was looking at the pelican with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. They always look like they shouldn't be able to fly, Margaret said, surprising herself. Too heavy, too ancient, and then they do. The man smiled. It was a good smile, the kind that reached his eyes without effort. That's the best description of Grace under pressure I've ever heard. Her name was Margaret. His name was Richard Alden Hayes, he said, extending his hand with a formality that was somehow charming rather than stiff. He had moved to Naples 8 months ago, he told her, after retiring from a career in civil engineering. He had spent most of his life in Atlanta, he said, and had been looking for somewhere quieter, somewhere closer to water. He had a daughter in Fort Lauderdale he saw on holidays. He enjoyed sailing, cooking, and reading history, mostly military history, though he was trying to branch out. She told him about the watercolor class. He laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and said he had tried oil painting once and produced something his daughter had described, charitably, as abstract. They talked for 40 minutes without either of them appearing to notice the time passing. When Margaret finally looked at her watch and made a small noise of surprise, he stood immediately, unhurried but courteous. "I hope I haven't kept you from anything important," he said. "Just dinner," she said. "And it's nothing I couldn't postpone." "Then, perhaps," he said carefully, with the measured confidence of a man who understood that some moments required precision, "you might consider postponing it in my direction. There's a place on Fifth Avenue I've been meaning to try. Nothing fancy, just good food and conversation that seems worth continuing." She should have said no, not because there was anything wrong with him, there wasn't, not anything visible, but because she had rules. She had been very deliberate about her rules. She had constructed them carefully over 6 years of widowhood, and she was proud of them. She said yes. Later she would try to identify the exact moment when everything began to go wrong. She would search her memory of that first evening, the candlelit restaurant, the bottle of Barolo he chose without making it into a performance, the way he listened to her talk about Donald without flinching or redirecting, the walk along the waterfront afterward when he offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and she would find nothing, not a single crack in the surface, not a shadow beneath the water. That was the thing about Richard Alden Hayes. He was very, very good at what he did. The first 3 months were something Margaret would later describe to her friend, Diane, as the most disorienting happiness I've ever felt. She did not mean disorienting in a negative sense, not at first. She meant it in the way that returning to something you thought was gone forever can unsettle you, the way your body doesn't quite know how to hold a joy it had stopped expecting. She had not anticipated this. She had genuinely believed, with the reasonable pragmatism of a woman in her 60s who had already experienced the full arc of a long marriage, that romantic love was something that belonged to an earlier of her life, not with bitterness, simply as fact. Richard dismantled that assumption quietly, methodically, and with apparent ease. He called every morning at 8:15, not 8, not 8:30, but 8:15, which she somehow found more intimate than a round number would have been. He remembered the names of her plants. He showed up one Saturday with a small ceramic pot he had found at a shop on 3rd Street South, and said it looked like something she'd described wanting for her back patio, and he was exactly right. He made her laugh at dinner parties in a way that Donald, God rest him, never quite had. He was interested in her opinions with a quality of attention that felt almost foreign, as though her thoughts genuinely surprised and delighted him. Her friend Diane Weston noticed first, the way best friends always do. "You're different," Diane said over lunch at Campillo, studying Margaret the way a doctor studies a patient who seems well but too well. Diane was 67, sharp-tongued, a retired attorney from Chicago who had moved to Naples a decade ago with her husband Gerald, and had never once pretended that Florida was anything other than a tactical retreat from winter. She had been Margaret's closest friend for 15 years. She did not do vague different how. Margaret asked, though she already knew. "Lighter," Diane said, which is either wonderful or suspicious. "With women our age, I'm never sure which." Margaret told her about Richard, all of it, the bench at Laudermilk, the restaurant on Fifth Avenue, the ceramic pot, the 8:15 calls. Diane listened with her attorney's patience, asking no questions until Margaret was finished. "Has he met Patrick yet?" Diane asked. "We've only been seeing each other 3 months. That's not an answer." "No," Margaret said. "Not yet." Diane nodded slowly. "And the daughter in Fort Lauderdale, have you met her?" "He says she's very private." They had a difficult few years after his wife died. She apparently blamed him, though he says it was complicated. "He doesn't push." Something crossed Diane's face, a small tightening around the eyes, that Margaret filed away and chose not to examine too closely. The relationship deepened through the winter months. the season when Naples filled with snowbirds and the streets on Fifth Avenue became clogged with Range Rovers from Ohio and Illinois. Richard and Margaret fell into the comfortable rhythms that couples develop without noticing the farmers. Market on Saturday mornings, sunset walks on the beach at Clam Pass. Tuesday evenings cooking dinner at her house because he said her kitchen had better light. He spoke about the future with the casual confidence of a man who assumed he had one with her, mentioning in passing a trip they might take to Portugal, a concert series in the spring she would enjoy, a boat he had been thinking of renting for a weekend on the water. She let herself believe it, every bit of it. She let herself believe it with the particular recklessness of someone who has been careful for a very long time and is exhausted by their own caution. The first fracture appeared on a Thursday evening in February. She had arrived at his condominium, a handsome unit on the 14th floor of a building on Gulf Shore Boulevard, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the water that she privately thought was even better than hers, 20 minutes earlier than planned. She had texted him from the parking garage and gotten no response, which was unusual but not alarming. He sometimes left his phone in the other room when he was cooking. She used the key he had given her 6 weeks prior, a gesture she had received as significant. He was on the balcony, his back to the door, speaking in a low and intense voice into his phone. She heard fragments before he noticed her, not enough to fully understand, but enough to feel the quality of the conversation as something different from anything she had heard from him before. The tone was harder, more pressured. She heard the word transfer and the word account, and what sounded like a name, a woman's name, before he turned and saw her standing in the living room. The change in his face was instantaneous and total. The hardness vanished. The warmth returned. He held up one finger a moment, and finished the conversation in 3 brief sentences she couldn't hear. Then came inside, sliding the glass door shut behind him. "You're early," he said. He was smiling. "I was just sorting out something with the property management in Atlanta. The old house is being sold and there are always complications." "Of course," she said. He kissed her on the cheek and moved to the kitchen and opened a bottle of wine, and the evening proceeded with its usual ease. They had sea bass that he had bought at the Mercado that morning and watched a documentary about the Galapagos Islands that she had suggested. He held her hand on the couch. He fell asleep briefly toward the end, and she sat watching the land iguanas on screen and listening to him breathe, and told herself that what she had heard, transfer, account, the woman's name she wasn't sure she had heard correctly, was nothing. The ordinary background noise of a man with a life before her. She almost convinced herself. 2 weeks later, her son Patrick called on a Wednesday off schedule, which was itself a signal. "Mom," he said, without preamble, in the voice she recognized from his teenage years as the one he used when he had decided something needed to be said and had steeled himself to say it. "Tom Briscoe's wife has a cousin who lives in Pelican Bay. She says she's seen Richard at Venetian Village with a woman. More than once." The kitchen went very still. "Patrick," she said carefully, "I'm not trying to upset you," he said. You deserve to know what people are seeing." She thanked him and ended the call and stood at her kitchen counter for a long time, staring at her herb garden through the window, the rosemary and the thyme, and the small pot of basil that was struggling in the winter light. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by how steady they were. She had not survived 31 years of marriage, and 6 years of widowhood, and 63 years of a full and complicated life without learning something essential about herself. She did not fall apart. She investigated. Margaret Calloway was, by nature and by practice, a methodical woman. She had been a high school English teacher for 27 years before retiring, a fact that people occasionally found surprising, as though they expected her practicality and precision to belong to a scientist or an accountant rather than someone who had spent her career thinking about language and story. But stories, she had always believed, were the most precise things humans made. They had structure. They had logic. They had cause and effect and consequence. They did not tolerate inconsistency for long. She began to look at Richard's story for inconsistencies. It was not something she did dramatically or obviously. She did not confront him or hire anyone, or announce her suspicions to Diane, who would have been supportive but whose response she was not yet ready to receive. She simply began to pay closer attention. She had been a reader her entire life, truly a reader, the kind who notices the small things, the word that doesn't quite fit, the metaphor that strains, and she brought that same quality of attention to the man she had been dating for 5 months. The first thing she noticed was the geography of his Atlanta story. Richard had spoken about his life there many times: the house in Buckhead, the engineering firm, the churches, the restaurants, the neighborhoods. She had listened with the easy absorption of someone receiving a gift, not the critical attention of someone evaluating evidence. Now she listened differently. She began asking specific questions, casually embedded in ordinary conversation, and noting when his answers were vivid and detailed and when they were strangely flat, when he shifted to generalities, changed the subject with a story, redirected with a question of his own. He was skilled at redirection. She began to notice how skilled. She called an old friend from her teaching years, Barbara, who had retired to Decatur, just outside Atlanta, and asked, with careful casualness, whether she knew anything about civil engineering firms operating out of Buckhead in the late 90s and early 2000s. Barbara didn't, but her son-in-law did. And 3 days later Barbara called back with the name of a colleague who might know. The colleague led to a phone call that confirmed, gently but clearly, that the firm Richard had named Hayes and Mercer Civil Engineering Associates did not appear in any professional directory Barbara's son-in-law could locate. Margaret sat with that information for 24 hours before doing anything with it. Then she called Diane. They met at Diane's house on a Friday afternoon. Sitting on the screened lanai with glasses of sweet tea, the sound of Diane's neighbor's lawn service buzzing in the background, Margaret laid out everything. The phone call she had overheard, Patrick's information about the woman at Venetian Village, the Atlanta story that didn't quite hold, the firm that didn't appear to exist. Diane listened with the stillness of someone who has heard many things in her life that she wished she hadn't. Margaret said finally, "Be honest with me." "Always," Diane said. "Am I being paranoid?" Diane looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. "You're being a woman who has learned to trust her instincts, and I think your instincts are correct." Diane's nephew worked in cybersecurity in Miami. She made the call that evening, and he agreed, as a favor to his aunt, quietly, without any formal engagement, to run a basic background search on Richard Alden Hayes, of Naples, Florida, formerly of Atlanta, Georgia. The results came back in 4 days. Margaret was in her garden when Diane called, her hands dark with soil, a flat of seedlings she was preparing to transplant sitting on the potting bench beside her. "Sit down," Diane said. "I'm fine standing," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. She had been preparing herself. "His name is Robert Allen Hargrove," Diane said. "He's 68 years old. He's not from Atlanta. He's from Macon, Georgia. He was a real estate agent, not an engineer, until he lost his license in 2009 following a fraud investigation. He has been investigated twice for elder financial fraud, once in Georgia and once in South Carolina. Neither case went to trial. He was briefly married, not to a woman who died, but to a woman who divorced him in 2014 and obtained a restraining order. The garden was very quiet. Margaret could hear a mockingbird somewhere in the oak tree above the fence line. "The daughter in Fort Lauderdale?" she asked. Her voice was impressively calm. She marveled at herself. "There is no daughter," Diane said. Margaret closed her eyes. The sun was warm on her face and the smell of the earth was rich and specific around her, and she stood very still, letting the information settle into the shape of truth. "There's something else," Diane said, carefully. "Tell me." "He's currently in a long-term relationship with a woman named Sylvia Beaumont. She lives in Pelican Bay." A pause. "She's 71, a widow. Her late husband was a developer." "Margaret." "She's been with him for 2 years. She has given him access to her financial accounts." Diane's nephew found wire transfers, multiple, over 14 months, totaling approximately— "Don't tell me the number," Margaret said quietly. A silence. "Tell me the number," Margaret said. "Close to $200,000, Diane said. The mockingbird sang. The seedlings waited on the potting bench. Margaret Calloway stood in her garden with her soil-dark hands at her sides and breathed the way she had learned to breathe. In the months after Donald died, slowly, from the bottom of her lungs, giving herself the time she needed to keep standing. She had not given Robert Allen Hargrove, Richard Alden Hayes, access to her financial accounts. She had been careful about that, perhaps instinctively, perhaps because she was not quite as trusting as she had allowed herself to appear. She had accepted his company and his warmth and his well-constructed story, and she had been preparing, slowly, to lower her remaining guard, but she had not yet done so. She was deeply, profoundly grateful, and simultaneously devastated in a way she had not anticipated, because the loss was not only financial, the loss was the particular kind that leaves no visible wound, the loss of the version of the future she had spent 5 months quietly building in the architecture of her imagination. The trip to Portugal, the spring concert series, Tuesday evenings and 8:15 calls, and the sense, however irrational she now understood it to have been, that she was not going to be alone for the rest of her life. That loss was real. It was its own kind of theft. "I need a day," she told Diane. "Of course. And then I need a plan," she said. "I know," Diane said. "I have one ready whenever you are." The plan, as Diane presented it the following afternoon, was both practical and precise, very much in keeping with who Diane Weston was. "You have 3 choices," Diane said, sitting across from Margaret at her kitchen table with a legal pad, a pen, and the demeanor of a woman who had spent decades building strategy in rooms where the stakes were high. "First, you walk away quietly. You end the relationship with a neutral excuse. You protect yourself. And you let whatever happens to Sylvia Beaumont happen. I don't recommend this. Second, you go to the police alone and report what you know, without involving Sylvia. This is clean but complicated, because most of what we have is second-hand, and without a direct victim willing to testify, it may go nowhere. Third, you contact Sylvia Beaumont directly." Margaret looked at the legal pad. "You found her contact information." "I found her address," Diane said. "Whether to use it is entirely your decision." There was a silence. "He's stealing from her," Margaret said. "She doesn't know." "Almost certainly not." "Then there's no real choice, is there?" Margaret said. It was not a question. Sylvia Beaumont lived in a pale yellow house on a quiet street in Pelican Bay, behind a low stucco wall covered in bougainvillea. Margaret drove there on a Saturday morning in March, alone, having told Diane that this was something she needed to do without an attorney beside her. She sat in her car in front of the house for 10 full minutes, watching a gardener prune the bougainvillea and listening to NPR without actually hearing it, and then she got out. Sylvia answered the door in a linen blouse and reading glasses, a paperback held in one hand. And for a moment the two women simply looked at each other on the threshold. Sylvia was small, silver-haired, with dark eyes that were immediately intelligent, and Margaret noticed, immediately wary. "My name is Margaret Calloway," Margaret said. "I believe we know the same man. May I come in?" The next 40 minutes were among the most difficult of Margaret's life. She had prepared for Sylvia to be disbelieving. She had prepared for anger, denial, the particular fury of a woman being told that her private life has been examined by a stranger. She had not fully prepared for Sylvia's silence, the complete, terrible stillness that settled over her face as Margaret spoke, laying out everything Diane's nephew had found, everything she herself had observed. Sylvia sat on her cream sofa with the paperback still in her lap and listened without expression. And when Margaret finished, she said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, quietly, "I gave him the power of attorney 2 months ago." The room went still. "He said it was easier for managing the rental properties," Sylvia continued, in the flat voice of someone reciting something they have just understood they should not have believed. "He was so logical about it, so calm. I have 3 properties. My husband left them to me, and he said with the complexity of the management, it would just streamline." She stopped. "Sylvia," Margaret said carefully. "He already has access to everything," Sylvia said. She looked up. Her dark eyes were dry but enormous. "Not just the accounts, the properties, all of it." They called a real estate attorney that afternoon. Diane came over and brought her nephew on speakerphone from Miami. Sylvia's daughter, who existed, unlike Richard's fictional child, arrived within 2 hours, pale and ferocious, and took charge of the calls to the financial institutions with a focused efficiency that Margaret found deeply moving. Meanwhile, Margaret called Richard. She had thought about this carefully. She had considered doing it by text, or having someone else do it, or simply going silent without explanation. But she was 63 years old and she had lived a full life, and she believed, in the marrow of her bones, in facing things directly. She called him on a Saturday afternoon from Sylvia's kitchen while Sylvia sat at her table with her daughter's hand over hers, and when he answered, warm, easy, Margaret, hi, I was just thinking about you, she took a breath and spoke. Robert, she said, a silence that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and told her everything she needed to know about the size of the lie she had been living inside. I don't know who, he began. Your name is Robert Allen Hargrove, she said, keeping her voice even. You're 68 years old. You're from Macon. You lost your real estate license in 2009. Your ex-wife's name is Karen, and she has a restraining order. There is no daughter in Fort Lauderdale. Another silence. Margaret, his voice had changed. The warmth was still there. She was grimly impressed by how present the warmth still was, but beneath it, now that she was listening for the mechanism rather than the music, she could hear the calculation. I've spoken with Sylvia, Margaret said. The warmth vanished. What replaced it was flat and efficient and completely without resemblance to the man she had believed she knew. That was a mistake, he said. For you, she said. Yes, it was. She ended the call. Her hands were shaking. She had not expected that. She had been steady through everything else, and now, standing in a stranger's kitchen on a Saturday afternoon in March, with the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears, her hands were shaking. Sylvia's daughter appeared at her elbow with a glass of water, and Margaret drank it and was grateful. By Monday morning, Diane's nephew had passed everything to a financial crimes investigator at the Collier County Sheriff's Office. The power of attorney Sylvia had signed was being reviewed by the real estate attorney, and a second opinion was being sought. 3 wire transfers that had occurred in the previous 60 days were flagged for review by Sylvia's bank. Robert Allen Hargrove, Richard Alden Hayes, was not at his condominium on Gulf Shore Boulevard when the investigators went to speak with him on Tuesday afternoon. He was gone. The building manager confirmed he had vacated 2 days prior. A forwarding address had been provided, it turned out, when investigated, to be a UPS store in Fort Myers. His phone number went to voicemail and then, by Wednesday morning, was disconnected. The investigators told Sylvia and Margaret, with the measured sympathy of people who had delivered this kind of news before, that men like Robert Hargrove were mobile by design, that there were likely other women in other cities, that the case would be kept open, and that if he used his standard patterns, and he would, there was a reasonable chance of eventual apprehension. They said reasonable chance in the specific, careful way that means the thing is possible but not promised. Sylvia sat in the investigator's office with her daughter beside her, and her hands folded in her lap, and asked quietly whether she would recover the money. The investigator was honest. Some of it, perhaps. Not all. That evening, Margaret drove home along Gulf Shore Boulevard with the windows down, and the night air coming off the water, and the lights of the condominiums reflecting in the Gulf in long broken lines of gold. She felt emptied out in a way she had not felt since the first weeks after Donald died, a clean emptiness, a swept floor feeling, as though something that had taken up a great deal of space had finally been removed and the floor beneath it was dusty but solid. She was angry. She was allowed to be angry, and she was. Not the hot, immediate anger of betrayal that had come and passed in Sylvia's garden the previous Saturday, but a cooler, more lasting anger at the specific architecture of what Robert Hargrove had built, the precision of it, the targeting, the way he had found them, 2 women in their 60s, both widowed, both capable, both lonely in that particular private way that is easy to miss if you don't know where to look. The way he had studied them and used exactly the things that made them themselves, their intelligence, their warmth, their capacity to love, as the tools of their own deception. She was angry about that for a long time. She thought that was reasonable. She parked in her driveway and sat in her car looking at her house and thought about the woman who had sat on a bench at Laudermilk Park 7 months ago with a paperback in her lap and said something about pelicans. She did not regret that woman. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the thing that surprised her most. She did not regret opening. She did not regret hoping. She did not wish herself into someone more armored, more closed, more permanently defended. The capacity to love, the specific and stubborn human willingness to believe that something good might be coming, was not the weakness that had put her in this position. It was the strength that was going to get her out of it. She went inside and made tea and called her son Patrick. Spring came to Naples the way it always did, not with drama, but with a gradual softening. The snowbirds began their annual migration north in April. the Range Rovers and the Connecticut license plates disappearing from Fifth Avenue, the restaurants growing quieter, the beaches widening again as the winter crowds thinned. The air changed, still warm, but less pressured, more genuinely itself. The bougainvillea on the walls along Creighton Road bloomed in violent, joyful pink. Margaret noticed it all. She had decided, going to be the kind of person who noticed things. She had always been that person, technically, the reader, the observer, the woman who remembered the names of plants and the quality of light at different hours. But somewhere in the 5 months of Richard Alden Hayes she had stopped fully noticing because she had been too busy being noticed. There was a lesson in that, she thought. Not a lesson against love or against hope, but a lesson about the danger of outsourcing your own attention. She kept all her Tuesday evenings now, not cooking for someone else, but for herself, working through a cookbook she had bought 2 winters ago and never opened, teaching herself to make things she had always ordered in restaurants. She was working her way through the fish section, which seemed appropriate given where she lived. The sea bass was a particular triumph. She and Sylvia Beaumont had lunched the first Wednesday of every month at a restaurant on 3rd Street South that they had both, it turned out, discovered independently before the events of that March. They had become, with the specific and slightly dark humor that sometimes bonds people who have been through something terrible together, genuine friends. Sylvia was sharp and funny, and less shattered than Margaret had feared, resilient in the way that people who have already survived one great loss often are, as though grief teaches a skill the rest of us only theorize about. The legal proceedings were slow, as legal proceedings are. 2 other women had been identified in South Carolina and Georgia with similar stories. Robert Hargrove had been located in August in Clearwater, remarkably close, beginning what appeared to be an identical pattern with a woman he had met at a marina. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning, which Margaret thought had a certain appropriateness to it. Tuesday had always been their cooking night. When Diane called to tell her, Margaret was in her garden, transplanting the seedlings she had been preparing on the afternoon she learned the truth. They were doing well, the basil especially, catching up at last, the leaves large and dark and fragrant in the late morning sun. They got him, Diane said. Good, Margaret said. How are you feeling? Margaret considered the question, honestly, the way she always tried to answer Diane. Relieved, she said. Still, a little angry. Mostly just here, present, which is good. It's better than good, Diane said. She wasn't wrong. Patrick came down for a long weekend in May with his wife Linda and their 2 children, and they took a boat out into the Gulf and ate grouper sandwiches on the water, and the kids jumped off the back of the boat with the fearlessness of people who haven't yet accumulated enough experience to know what can go wrong. Margaret watched them and felt something she recognized after a moment as simple happiness, not complicated, not earned by suffering, just happiness, showing up without needing to be summoned. She signed up for a second watercolor class in the fall. She was no better than she had been. She found she didn't mind. On a Thursday evening in October, she went back to Laudermilk Park. She sat on the same bench, in roughly the same position. With a different paperback, she had actually read this one, and her shoes off, and her feet tucked beneath her. The Gulf was doing what the Gulf does, lying beautifully, blue and glittering, and absolutely convincing in its stillness. She watched a brown pelican glide in over the water. She thought about what she would tell the woman who had sat here a year ago, if such a thing were possible. She thought about what she had learned, not the obvious lessons, the Book of Love Strangers lessons, the Google people before trusting them lessons. Though those mattered, she thought about the deeper thing. She had not been foolish. That was the first thing she would say. She had been human, which is different and important. Being human meant having the courage to hope. It meant being willing to sit on a bench on a beautiful evening and talk to a stranger about a pelican. It meant not armoring yourself so thoroughly against loss that you also armored yourself against everything else. Robert Hargrove had preyed specifically on that humanity, targeted it with precision, and she would always be angry about that, but she would not let him take it from her. She would not let the lesson be close yourself, because that was his final theft, the one he had tried and failed to complete. She was Margaret Elaine Calloway. She was 63 years old. She lived in Naples, Florida, in a house with a garden she tended and a kitchen she was learning, and a friendship she had built from wreckage, with a woman named Sylvia who made her laugh. She had a son who called on Sundays, and a daughter in Denver, and a best friend who kept a legal pad ready for emergencies. She had survived a marriage, a death, a grief, and a lie. She was not the same woman who had sat on this bench a year ago. She was more careful now, yes, but not closed. She was more clear-eyed about what she was worth and what she was willing to offer, and at what pace. She had recalibrated rather than retreated. She would love again, she thought. If something real appeared, she would not go looking, but she would not run from it either. The Pelican Bank left, improbably graceful, and disappeared over the horizon. Margaret turned the page. She would tell her story. Not to everyone, and not immediately, but she would tell it, because women she did not know and would never meet were sitting right now on their own benches in their own Naples, in their own small Florida cities and Midwestern towns and quiet suburbs. Lonely in the particular way that is easy to miss. And some of them were already talking to a stranger who was paying close attention. Those women deserved to know that the charming man with the warm voice and the 8:15 calls and the impossible attention might be studying them the way a reader studies a text, not for love, but for leverage. This story, her story, was for them. She would speak it clearly, without shame, because the shame belonged entirely to Robert Allen Hargrove and not one molecule of it to her. She would say, "I opened. He was wrong. I am still here," she would say. "You are allowed to hope. Just keep your eyes open," she would say. "A pelican shouldn't be able to fly, but it does."